The billionaire was shocked when a little girl offered him a rose. Then he discovered the heartbreaking truth. At first, everything seemed normal. Just another quiet afternoon in a house too big for one man's grief. But a 3-year-old girl was about to walk into a billionaire's living room holding a single red rose, and by the time she reached him, his entire world would crack open. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know what she'd already lost. He definitely didn't know what he was about to lose all over again: his composure, his walls, his carefully built silence. Stay with me, because what happened in that room didn't just shock him. It changed everything that came after. Hey friends, welcome back. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today and what country you call home. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Today's story is one of those quiet, heart-tugging ones about a man who had everything except a reason to feel anything, and a little girl who handed him one without even knowing it. There's a truth waiting in this story that's going to break your heart before it puts it back together. Let's get into it. Nobody in that mansion had heard Alexander Hale laugh in almost a year. The staff who worked in the Great White House on the Hill in Connecticut had learned, slowly and carefully, the rhythm of his silence. He rose at 5. He ran the treadmill in the East Wing gym until 6:30. He was in his office by 7, and by 7:15 the first video call of the day had already begun, his voice flat and precise, discussing numbers that most people would need a calculator and a law degree to understand. He owned 3 companies outright and held controlling stakes in 11 others. He was 28 years old, and Forbes had put him on a cover the year before with the headline, "The Coldest Man in Tech." He had framed it. Not out of pride. Out of something closer to confirmation. The house itself told the story before anyone needed to say a word. Marble floors that echoed every footstep back at you like the building itself was lonely. A curved staircase that led up to 7 bedrooms, 6 of which had never been slept in. Oil paintings of people Alexander had never met, purchased at auction because his interior designer said empty walls made a house feel unfinished. There were fresh roses in the entryway every single week, a standing order with a florist in Greenwich, and Alexander walked past them every single day without once looking at them. Elena Vasquez had been hired 4 months earlier as the new head of household staff, replacing a woman who had retired after 19 years. Elena was 31, quiet in the way that comes from having learned exactly how much space the world will let you take up, and thorough in a way her employer noticed, but never commented on. She showed up at 6:40 every morning and left at 4 in the afternoon, and in between she ran that enormous house like clockwork: laundry, meals, schedules, the small invisible architecture that made Alexander's frictionless life possible. What Alexander did not know, because he had never asked, was that Elena had a daughter. Her name was Lily. She was 3 years old, with a mass of dark curls her mother spent every morning trying to tame into a bow, and eyes that seemed to take in far more of the world than a toddler had any business understanding. Elena's mother, who normally watched Lily during work hours, had fallen and broken her hip 3 weeks earlier. There was no one else. Elena had 2 choices: lose the job that was keeping a roof over their heads, or bring Lily along and pray that a 200,000 square foot mansion had enough quiet corners to hide a 3-year-old in. She chose the second option, and she chose it in silence, tucking Lily into the small sitting room off the kitchen with a coloring book and a juice box each morning, praying that Mr. Hale's schedule kept him in his office long enough that he'd never know. For 3 weeks, it worked. Elena moved through the house with a kind of practiced tension, always aware of where Lily was, always listening for the particular pitch of a toddler's laughter that might carry too far down a marble hallway. She had read the employment contract twice. Nowhere did it explicitly forbid bringing a child to work, because no one had ever imagined a housekeeper would need to. But she also knew, in the way you know things about powerful men without being told, that Alexander Hale did not want children in his house. He had never said it. He didn't have to. It was in the way he stepped around the topic whenever his sister-in-law's kids visited for the rare obligatory holiday, in the way his shoulders tightened at the sound of running feet. Elena didn't know why. She only knew the rule: unspoken as it was, and she followed it as carefully as she followed every other rule in that house. Until the Tuesday afternoon that Lily got bored. It started small. Elena was upstairs changing linens in the West Wing, a task that took exactly 11 minutes if nothing interrupted her, and something did. Lily, left with a coloring book she'd already filled in twice, had wandered to the window of the sitting room and seen, through the glass, the garden full of roses, red and full and glowing gold in the afternoon light. She had never seen so many roses in one place. She pushed open the door that led out to the side terrace, a door Elena always meant to double-check was locked and, that day, hadn't been. Lily walked into the garden alone. She stood among the rose bushes for a long moment, small in her blue party dress that Elena had put her in that morning because they were out of clean play clothes, and she reached out with careful, curious fingers and touched a bloom. It came away from the stem easier than she expected. Elena had been trimming that bed the day before, and the cut was fresh, the thorns mostly clipped. Lily held the rose the way she'd seen her mother hold flowers on the rare occasion someone gave them to her, gently, with both hands, like it was something that could break. Then she turned back toward the house, and through the tall glass doors of the living room, she saw a man sitting alone on a cream-colored couch, staring at nothing. She had never met him. She didn't know his name, didn't know he was the reason her mother's shoulders were always tight with worry, didn't know what the next 5 minutes would come to mean for both of their lives. She only knew that he looked, in a way she was too young to have words for but not too young to feel, like someone who needed a flower. So she walked toward the door and pushed it open and stepped inside. The moment Alexander felt the air shift, he knew something was wrong before he even turned his head. He had been sitting on the living room sofa for the better part of 20 minutes, his tablet open beside him, a quarterly report he wasn't reading. This was a thing he did sometimes, in the gaps between calls, sat perfectly still in a beautiful room and let the silence press down on him like a weight he'd stopped trying to lift. It was the closest thing he had to rest. Then the terrace door clicked, and small footsteps, uneven and light, crossed the marble. He looked up expecting a member of the household staff. Instead, he saw a little girl in a rumpled blue dress, dark curls escaping a small white bow, walking toward him with the unhurried confidence of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of adults. In her hands, held out in front of her like an offering, was a single red rose. Alexander's whole body went rigid. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was older than fear, and it hit somewhere beneath his ribs before his mind had even caught up to what he was looking at. The last time someone had handed him a rose like that, held with both small hands, presented without hesitation, he had been 11 years old, in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fear. And his 6-year-old sister Grace had picked one from the vase at the nurse's station and pressed it into his hands and said, "For you, so you don't feel sad," 3 days before the car accident that would take both her and their parents and leave Alexander. At 11, suddenly and permanently alone in a world too large for him to understand. He had not held a rose since. He had banned them from most of the house and only kept the entryway arrangement because his assistant had set it up years ago and he'd never had the heart or the words to explain why he wanted it gone. And now there was a child standing in front of him, offering one exactly the way Grace had. "Here," Lily said, in the simple, unadorned way that toddlers say enormous things. "You looked sad." Alexander's hand rose to his chest without his permission, pressing flat against his sternum as though he could hold something in or keep something out. His breath caught audibly. For one long, terrible second, he was not a 28-year-old billionaire in a mansion in Connecticut. He was 11 years old in a hospital hallway, and the floor was tilting, and nothing made sense. Where his voice came out rough, unfamiliar even to himself. "Where did you come from?" That was the exact moment Elena rounded the corner from the hallway, having realized somewhere around minute 9 of the 11-minute task that the house had gone quiet in a way that never meant anything good with a 3-year-old. She saw the terrace door standing open. She saw the empty coloring book. And then she stepped into the living room and saw her daughter standing in front of Alexander Hale, offering him a rose, and every ounce of blood left Elena's face. Lily. The word came out sharper than she meant it to, fear translating instantly into a tone she almost never used. She crossed the room in 3 strides and swept her daughter up against her hip, murmuring apologies before she'd even fully processed what she was apologizing for. Mr. Hale, I am so sorry. I don't know how she got out here. She was supposed to be. Whose child is this? Alexander's voice was still not entirely steady, and something in the strange rawness of it made Elena's stomach drop even further, because she couldn't tell if he was angry or something else entirely. Mine, Elena said, because there was no version of this where lying would help. My daughter. My mother usually watches her, but she broke her hip 3 weeks ago, and I didn't. I know I should have said something. I know it's against. There's no rule against it, Alexander said, cutting her off, and his voice had gone strange and quiet. I never wrote a rule. I'm still sorry. It won't happen again. Elena was already backing toward the hallway, Lily perched on her hip, the little girl twisting to look back over her mother's shoulder at the man on the couch, who was still holding the rose she'd handed him, staring at it like it might disappear. Wait. The word left him before he'd decided to say it. Elena froze. Alexander looked up, and for the first time since she'd started working there, she saw something in his face that wasn't distance. It looked almost like grief. What's her name? Lily, Elena said carefully. She's 3. Alexander nodded slowly, his jaw tight, and looked back down at the rose in his hands. Take the rest of the afternoon off, he said, which was not what either of them expected. Both of you. Paid. I need to make a call. Elena left with Lily, confused and unsettled, replaying the strange transaction over and over as she carried her daughter down the hall, trying to understand what she'd just witnessed and knowing only that something about that moment had cracked something open in a man everyone in that house had assumed was made of stone. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the call Alexander needed to make wasn't a call at all. It was 15 minutes alone in his office with the door locked, his forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, breathing through a wave of grief he had spent 17 years outrunning. And she had no way of knowing that this was only the first of 2 secrets that would surface that week, because while Alexander was drowning quietly in a memory of his sister, Elena was carrying a secret of her own, one far heavier than a rose. One she had been carefully hiding from everyone, including almost herself. The truth came out 3 days later, and Alexander wasn't even supposed to hear it. He'd come downstairs later than usual that evening, having lost track of time on a call with his legal team, and the house had gone quiet in the particular way it did after Elena had finished for the day and the rest of the staff had left. He wasn't expecting anyone to still be there. So when he heard a voice coming from the small sitting room off the kitchen, the same room where Lily's coloring books lived, he stopped in the hallway without meaning to eavesdrop, and then found he couldn't make himself walk away. I understand, Elena was saying, her voice pitched low, careful, the voice of someone trying very hard to sound calm for the sake of whoever was listening. No, I understand. I just need to know how much time we're talking about, realistically. Because I have a daughter and I need to plan. Silence, presumably while someone on the other end of the line spoke. Right, Elena said again. Okay. And the treatment you mentioned, the one that isn't covered, how much would that actually run, altogether? Another pause, longer this time, and when Elena spoke again her voice had cracked slightly at the edges, though she caught it fast. That's okay. That's not something I can do right now. Is there a payment plan, or? Alexander did not remember deciding to step into the doorway. He simply found himself there, and Elena looked up, phone still pressed to her ear, and her face went through 3 visible stages of shock in under 2 seconds, surprise, then horror at being overheard, then a kind of exhausted resignation. As if some part of her had known the secret couldn't stay buried in a house this size forever. I have to call you back, she said quietly into the phone, and hung up. For a moment neither of them said anything. Alexander became aware, distantly, that he was still holding the tablet he'd carried down with him, and that his hand had gone very still around it. How bad is it? He asked finally. Elena's chin lifted, a reflex of pride even now. It's not your concern, Mr. Hale. You collapsed in my living room a hair short of falling over onto my daughter's flower bed 3 weeks ago and told my head of staff it was low blood sugar. Alexander's voice was quiet, but there was something insistent underneath it. I let it go because it wasn't my business. Is it my business now? Elena was quiet for a long moment, weighing. Alexander could see exactly how much of herself she was willing to hand over to a man who signed her paycheck. Finally, something in her seemed to give way. Not surrender, exactly, but the simple exhaustion of having carried something alone for too long. I have a mass in my left breast, she said, flatly, the way you say something you've had to say so many times to doctors and insurance representatives that the words have stopped being able to hurt you the way they should. Found it 4 months ago. It's aggressive. The oncologist wants to start an intensive treatment protocol, one that has a real chance of working, according to him, but it's not fully covered, and what isn't covered is more than I make in 2 years. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, except there was no humor in it at all. So I've been trying to figure out how to buy myself time on a housekeeper's salary. I took this job specifically because it's 11 minutes from the hospital where my oncologist is. I didn't tell you that in the interview because it seemed like the kind of thing that gets you not hired. Alexander said nothing. He was doing the math anyone would do, automatically and without wanting to, what happens to a 3-year-old girl if the worst version of this story comes true. Elena, watching his face, seemed to read the calculation happening behind his eyes, because her expression hardened slightly. I don't need your pity, she said. I've handled harder things than this. My husband died 4 years ago, heart condition nobody caught in time, and I got through that with a newborn and no family within 800 miles, so I promise you, I will handle this too. I just need you to forget you heard any of it, because if this house decides I'm too much of a liability, I lose the job that's currently keeping my daughter fed, and then none of it matters anyway. I'm not going to fire you. The words came out before Alexander had fully decided he meant them, though as soon as he said them, he found that he did. That was never what I was thinking. Then what were you thinking? Alexander looked down at his hands, and for reasons he didn't examine too closely in that moment, he found himself telling her something he had told almost no one in 17 years. When I was 11, my parents and my little sister died in a car accident. I was in the car too. I was the only one who walked away from it. His voice was steady, clinical almost, the way you describe something you've built a fortress of distance around. 3 days before it happened, my sister handed me a rose in a hospital hallway. She'd had her tonsils out. Nothing serious. We were just visiting, and she told me not to be sad. That's the last real memory I have of her. I haven't touched a rose since. And then 4 days ago, your daughter walked into my living room and handed me one and said the exact same thing. Elena's hard expression cracked slightly, replaced by something more complicated. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me, Alexander went on. I'm telling you because I understand, better than most people would, what it means for a child to lose everything without warning. And I am not going to sit in this house and do nothing while that becomes a live possibility for your daughter. So no, you're not fired. And no, I'm not offering pity. He met her eyes. I'm offering whatever it actually costs to fix this. All of it. Elena refused him 3 times before the week was out. The first refusal came that same night, immediately, reflexive as breathing. Absolutely not. I won't take charity from my employer. That's not a normal thing that happens between people. Delivered with the particular fierceness of someone who has spent years building her entire identity around not needing anyone's rescue. The second came 2 days later, when Alexander had his assistant quietly reach out to Elena's oncologist's office to inquire about payment logistics, and Elena found out and stormed into his office, furious in a way he hadn't seen from her before, accusing him of going around her, of treating her like a project instead of a person. I am not a broken thing you get to fix, because it makes you feel better about your dead sister, she said, and the words landed hard enough that Alexander actually flinched, because some small ugly part of him worried it might be true. He sat with that accusation for 2 full days before he answered it, and when he did, it wasn't with an apology exactly. It was with something closer to an explanation. "You're right that I don't know how to do this," he told her, standing in the doorway of the small sitting room where she was folding laundry with more force than the task strictly required. "I've spent 17 years making sure I never had to need anyone, and never had anyone need anything from me either. Because needing things is how you end up in a hospital hallway getting handed a flower by someone who's about to disappear from your life forever. I don't know how to offer help without it feeling transactional, because I've never actually done it before. Not once. Not really." He paused. "But I'm not doing this to feel better about Grace. I'm doing it because your daughter is 3 years old, and there is a version of the next year where she grows up the way I did, and I have the ability to make sure that version never happens, and I would have to live with myself if I didn't at least try." Elena stopped folding. She didn't look at him for a long moment. "I need it to not be pity," she said finally, quietly. "It's not pity," Alexander said. "It's the first thing I've wanted to do in longer than I can remember that wasn't about a quarterly earnings call." The third refusal, 2 days after that, was quieter, and it was really more of a negotiation than a refusal at all. Elena, sitting across from him at the kitchen island with a legal pad of numbers between them, insisting that whatever he covered be structured as a loan, repayable with interest, so that it could never be called anything other than what she needed it to be, a business arrangement between two people, not a rescue. Alexander agreed to the fiction, because he understood, in a way that surprised him, that the fiction mattered more to her dignity than the money mattered to his bank account. He had his lawyers draw up actual loan paperwork. He never once intended to collect on it, and some quiet, growing part of him suspected Elena knew that too, and was choosing, for now, to let them both pretend otherwise. What neither the loan paperwork nor the tense kitchen negotiations captured was what was happening underneath all of it, the strange, halting thought taking place in a house that had been frozen for 17 years. It started with small things. Alexander began coming home earlier, not much earlier, but enough that he was occasionally in the house while Lily was still there in the afternoons, since Elena's arrangements for after-school care had fallen through along with her mother's mobility. He found himself, one Tuesday, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the sitting room while Lily colored, unsure what one was supposed to say to a 3-year-old, before finally sitting down across from her on the floor. An act that would have been unthinkable to him a month earlier, a billionaire in a $5,000 suit sitting cross-legged on a Persian rug and asking her, haltingly, what color the sky should be. "Purple," Lily informed him with total confidence. "Because purple is better." "That seems like a strong opinion," Alexander said. "It's a fact," Lily said, and went back to coloring, and Alexander found something in his chest loosen slightly that had been tight for so long he'd forgotten it was possible for it to do anything else. He fixed the old wooden swing in the garden that had come with the house and had never once been used, hired no one to do it, did it himself on a Saturday with instructions pulled up on his phone, sanding down the seat and oiling the chains until it moved smooth and silent under the oak tree near the rose bed. He didn't tell Elena he'd done it. He just left it there, finished, and the following Monday, when Lily discovered it and shrieked with the kind of pure joy that echoed through the whole garden, he watched from his office window and felt something that took him almost a full minute to correctly identify. It was happiness. Small, uncomplicated, unfamiliar. He hadn't felt it in so long he'd nearly forgotten its shape. The thing about grief you've carried for 17 years is that it doesn't leave all at once, no matter how badly you want it to. It leaves in pieces, at its own pace, usually when you're not looking directly at it. Alexander found this out over the following weeks, in the accumulation of small, unremarkable Tuesdays. He learned that Lily liked her crackers broken into exact quarters, no exceptions, and that she narrated her own coloring in a steady, serious murmur that no one else seemed to be able to hear, but that he found himself listening for. He learned that Elena, despite everything, still hummed while she worked, an old habit, she told him once, from her own mother, who used to say a house wasn't properly clean unless there was a song in it somewhere. He learned, too, that Elena was determined not to let her illness change the way she showed up in the world. She had started the intensive treatment protocol 2 weeks after that difficult conversation in his office, and the effects came on faster than either of them expected. There were days she arrived at 6:40 exactly as always, moved through the house with her usual quiet thoroughness, and then, by mid-afternoon, would disappear into the small bathroom off the laundry room for longer than made sense, emerging pale and steady-voiced, insisting she was fine. Alexander began noticing the pattern before she was willing to admit there was one to notice. "You don't have to keep doing that," he told her one Thursday, after she'd come back from one of those long absences looking gray around the mouth, still trying to fold towels like nothing had happened. "The full schedule. I can adjust your hours without adjusting your pay. No one has to know why." "Everyone will know why," Elena said. "That's how houses work. And I don't want Lily's whole world reorganized around the word sick before it has to be." Alexander understood that logic even as it worried him, because he recognized it, the same instinct that had made him, at 11, insist to every well-meaning adult that he was fine, that he didn't need to talk about it, that he'd rather just go back to school and pretend the hallway with the rose had never happened. He learned, watching Elena, that this kind of pride wasn't really about strength. It was about control, the desperate need to hold on to some part of your life that illness or grief hadn't already taken from you. So instead of arguing, he adjusted around her without announcing it. He started scheduling his own calls for the mornings, so he was reliably present in the afternoons when Elena's energy tended to dip, present enough that Lily had somewhere safe to be without anyone needing to say the word help out loud. He learned to identify the specific tired that meant Elena needed to sit down for 10 minutes without being asked, and he began, without comment, simply taking Lily into the garden or the small library during those windows, giving her mother the silence to recover in. It became, without either of them fully naming it, a kind of team. Elena watched this unfold with a complicated mixture of gratitude and disbelief. The man the tabloids called cold, the man whose own household staff had a standing joke about how long you could go without seeing him actually smile, was sitting on the floor of her daughter's playroom most afternoons now, building precarious towers out of wooden blocks with the same intensity he apparently brought to closing 8-figure deals, and losing, deliberately and often, so that Lily could shriek with laughter as the tower toppled. "You're good at this," Elena told him one evening, finding them both sprawled on the rug, blocks scattered everywhere, Lily asleep against Alexander's arm in the particular boneless way that toddlers fall asleep, all at once and without warning. "I don't know what I'm doing," Alexander said quietly, careful not to move and wake her. "I never had anyone do this for me. Not after I was 11. My uncle took me in because it was the responsible thing to do, and he did the responsible things: school, clothes, doctor's appointments, but nobody ever sat on the floor with me. I'm sort of making this up as I go." "You're doing fine," Elena said, and there was something new in her voice when she said it, something warmer than an employer's gratitude, though neither of them examined it too closely yet. "Better than fine." Alexander looked down at the sleeping child against his arm, and then up at her mother, standing in the doorway with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something unguarded, something that looked almost like hope, and for the first time in 17 years. The silence in that enormous house didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like the ordinary quiet of a family at the end of a long day. He didn't have a name yet for what was growing in that house. He only knew that he no longer dreaded coming home. The setback came on a Wednesday, and it came without warning, the way the worst things always seem to. Elena had seemed fine that morning, tired, but the particular manageable tired that had become their new normal, the kind she pushed through with the same stubborn will she pushed through everything. She'd dropped Lily in the sitting room with her coloring books, started the day's laundry, and by 10 a.m. she was on the kitchen floor. It was one of the junior staff who found her, and the house exploded into the kind of controlled chaos that only happens when something has gone seriously wrong. Alexander was in a board call when his assistant burst into his office without knocking, something that had never happened once in 6 years of employment, and said only, "It's Elena, we're calling an ambulance." And Alexander was out of his chair and moving before the sentence had even fully landed. She was conscious by the time the paramedics arrived, disoriented and apologetic in the exact maddening way Alexander had come to expect from her, insisting she was fine, that it was nothing, that everyone needed to stop making a fuss. The paramedics didn't agree. Her blood counts, it would turn out later that day, had dropped to a dangerous level, a known risk of the treatment, one her oncologist had warned her about and one she had not mentioned to anyone at the house, because mentioning it would have meant admitting how hard the last 2 weeks had actually been. Alexander rode in the ambulance. He didn't examine the decision, didn't weigh whether it was appropriate for an employer to do such a thing. He simply did it, the same unthinking instinct that had gotten him down the stairs before his mind had caught up with his feet. Which left Lily 3 years old, alone in a strange section of a strange house, having just watched her mother be carried out on a stretcher, in the care of a staff who genuinely did not know what to do with her, until Alexander, from the back of the ambulance, called his assistant and said 4 words that would have been unthinkable from him 3 months earlier: "Bring her to me." He met his assistant at the hospital entrance 20 minutes later. Lily, tear-streaked and shaking, took one look at him and reached her arms up without hesitation, and Alexander, a man who had spent 17 years constructing an entire life designed around never being needed, lifted her onto his hip like he'd been doing it for years, and something in his chest cracked open completely. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" Lily asked into his shoulder, small and scared in a way that undid him completely. "Yes," Alexander said, with a certainty he did not entirely feel, but was determined to make true through sheer force of will. "Yes, baby. She's going to be okay." He did not go home that night. He sat in a hospital waiting room with a 3-year-old asleep against his chest, ordering food he didn't eat, answering emails he barely read, waiting for updates that came too slowly. At 2 in the morning, a nurse finally told him Elena was stable, that they'd adjusted her treatment schedule, that she'd need to be monitored more closely going forward, but that this particular crisis had passed. Alexander didn't cry easily. He hadn't, not really, since he was 11 years old. But sitting in that hard plastic chair at 2 in the morning, a sleeping child in his arms and relief crashing through him so hard it left him shaking, he found that he was crying anyway, silent and unstoppable. 17 years of carefully maintained distance finally, completely, giving way. He understood, in that moment, with total clarity, exactly what he was feeling and exactly what it meant. It wasn't obligation. It wasn't guilt about Grace, or some complicated debt he owed his own childhood grief. It was simply, plainly, love for a stubborn, prideful, exhausted woman fighting for her life on the floor above him, and for the small sleeping girl in his arms who had handed him a rose on an ordinary Tuesday and cracked his whole frozen world back open. He was not going to let either of them go through the rest of this alone. Not for one more day. Elena woke the next morning to fluorescent light, the low hum of hospital machinery, and Alexander Hale asleep in the chair beside her bed, Lily curled against his chest under his suit jacket, both of them dead to the world. She lay still for a long moment, taking in the sight, before her voice, rough with sleep and dehydration, finally broke the quiet. "You didn't have to stay." Alexander's eyes opened immediately. He hadn't been sleeping deeply, some part of him still on alert. "I wasn't going to leave her in a waiting room." "I meant you didn't have to stay," Elena said again, gesturing weakly at the chair, at the rumpled suit, at all of it. "I know what you meant." Alexander shifted carefully so as not to wake Lily. "I stayed anyway." There was a long silence, filled mostly with the beeping of a monitor and the particular exhaustion of a woman who had just been told, in careful medical language, that her body was fighting a harder battle than she'd let herself admit even to herself. "I heard the doctor's update this morning," Alexander said finally, "before you woke up. About the counts and the adjusted schedule going forward." He paused. "I also heard him say the words 'more support at home' about 4 times, in the careful tone doctors use when they mean something is genuinely necessary, and they're worried the patient will refuse it out of pride." Elena's jaw tightened. "I'm not moving into your house, Alexander." It was the first time she'd used his first name. Neither of them commented on it, though both of them noticed. "I wasn't going to suggest that." A small, unfamiliar smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Though I notice you assumed I might. You've been unpredictable lately." I have an idea, Alexander said, more seriously now. Not charity. Not a loan either, since I know you'll fight me on the specifics again. A trade. I need someone to manage the house full-time in a way that goes beyond scheduling laundry, someone to actually run it, coordinate my calendar, handle the property, the kind of role that comes with a real salary and real benefits, including the best medical coverage money can buy, because that's simply what the role requires. You'd be doing a real job. You'd also be 5 minutes from your oncologist instead of 11, because the position would come with staff housing on the property, a guest cottage, fully separate, entirely yours. Not some arrangement that requires you to live under the same roof as your boss and answer to anyone's schedule but your own. Elena stared at him. That's not a real job. That's a rescue with a job title stapled to it. It's both, Alexander said honestly. I won't pretend it isn't. But the work would be real, and you'd be doing it, and Lily would grow up close enough to a proper garden to have somewhere to run, and you'd have 5 fewer minutes between yourself and the people keeping you alive. I'm not offering you pity, Elena. I'm offering you room to actually fight this without also fighting your commute, your bank account, and your pride all at the same time. Lily stirred against his chest, murmured something unintelligible, and settled again. Elena watched her daughter sleep against a man who, for months ago, hadn't known her name, and felt something in her resolve, the fierce, exhausting insistence that she do this entirely alone, finally, quietly, begin to loosen. I need to think about it, she said. Take all the time you need, Alexander said. I'm not going anywhere. She said yes 11 days later. On the same afternoon, her latest scan came back showing the tumor had shrunk for the first time since her diagnosis. Not gone. Not yet, the oncologist was careful to emphasize, but responding, meaningfully, to the treatment in a way that gave everyone in that hospital room permission to breathe a little easier for the first time in months. The move happened quickly after that. Elena and Lily settled into the guest cottage at the edge of the property, a small stone building with its own garden that had sat mostly unused for years, and within a week it had become, in the particular way small children reorganize a space without asking permission, thoroughly and chaotically, Lily's crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, small shoes scattered by the door, a stuffed rabbit that had somehow ended up wedged permanently between the couch cushions. Alexander found himself walking down to the cottage most evenings, not because his new arrangement with Elena required it, but because he discovered, somewhere in the last 4 months, that he preferred the noise of that small house to the silence of his own. He and Elena had settled into something that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite anything else yet, either long conversations on the cottage porch after Lily was asleep, about nothing important and everything important, about his sister and her husband and the particular loneliness of being the person left standing after loss takes everyone else away. I used to think being needed by someone would feel like a burden, Alexander admitted one evening, watching fireflies gather over the rose bed. I spent 17 years making sure I never had to find out. Turns out I had it backwards. Being needed by the two of you is the first thing that's ever made this house feel less like a museum and more like a home. Elena was quiet for a moment, turning her mug of tea in her hands. I used to think needing help meant I'd failed at something, she said. That's what my mother taught me, without meaning to, that a woman on her own has to be entirely self-sufficient, or she's not really managing at all. It took nearly dying to teach me that letting people in isn't the same as failing. She glanced at him. You didn't have to be one of the people who taught me that, you know. You could have just signed the checks from a distance and let your lawyers handle the rest. I could have, Alexander agreed. I didn't want to. The treatment continued through the following weeks with the slow, unglamorous rhythm of real recovery, good days and hard days, scans that brought relief and appointments that brought new worry. The ordinary, unbearable waiting that comes with fighting for your life in installments. Alexander was there for most of it, not because it was his job to be, but because somewhere in the last several months, without either of them formally deciding it, he had become the kind of person Elena and Lily simply expected to find beside them. Lily, for her part, had stopped asking whether her mother was going to be okay, replacing the question with a simpler and more confident version of the same hope. she had started calling the guest cottage our house and the main mansion Alex's house. And increasingly, without anyone teaching her to, our house some mornings and our house others, the two houses blurring in her small mind into a single, expansive idea of home that included both buildings and, more importantly, both adults. She'd come to trust completely. The full remission came 7 months after the afternoon Lily first walked into that living room with a rose in her hands. Elena got the call from her oncologist on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, standing in the kitchen of the main house with a dish towel still in her hands, and when she hung up the phone she stood so still for so long that Alexander, working at the kitchen island nearby, finally looked up in alarm. "Elena." "They can't find anything," Elena said, her voice cracking wide open on the words. "The last scan. It's clear," he said. She had to stop, pressing the dish towel against her mouth for a moment before she could continue. He said, "We're calling it remission." Alexander was across the kitchen and had her wrapped in his arms before either of them had consciously decided that was what was happening, and Elena, who had held herself together through diagnosis and treatment and a hospital floor and 7 months of fighting for her life with a stubborn, exhausted grace that had rebuilt something in Alexander he thought had died at 11 years old, finally let herself fall apart completely, sobbing into his shoulder with the particular relief that only comes after you've spent months preparing yourself for a worse ending. "You're okay," Alexander said into her hair, his own voice unsteady. "You're okay. You're going to watch her grow up." "I know," Elena said, half laughing through the tears now. "I know. I'm going to watch her grow up." That evening, once Lily had been told the news in the simplified way you explain enormous things to a 4-year-old, "Mommy's all better," the doctors said so, and had celebrated by insisting on pancakes for dinner. A request Alexander granted without hesitation. The three of them ended up in the garden as the sun went down, Lily swinging on the wooden swing Alexander had fixed all those months ago, singing something tuneless and joyful to herself, while Alexander and Elena sat together on the bench nearby. "I need to tell you something," Alexander said, watching Lily swing higher and higher, unafraid in the way only very young children are. "And I need you to know I'm not saying it because of the remission, or because I'm relieved, or any complicated reason attached to everything we've been through this year. I'm saying it because it's true, and it's been true for a while, and I think you already know." Elena turned to look at him, waiting. "I love you," Alexander said simply. "Both of you. I loved you before I understood what that word actually meant, because I'd forgotten, and I think I've been relearning it this whole year, one afternoon at a time, on this exact swing, in that exact garden. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I just needed you to know." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching her daughter swing under the darkening sky, and then she reached over and took Alexander's hand, lacing their fingers together with a certainty that answered the question more completely than words could have. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for a while. I was just too tired fighting for my life to say it out loud." They sat like that until the fireflies came out and Lily finally tired herself out on the swing and ran to climb into both their laps at once, declaring with the total confidence of a 4-year-old that this was, without question, the best day of her entire life. A year to the day after Lily first walked into that living room holding a single red rose, the roses in that garden were in full, extravagant bloom. Climbing the trellis Alexander had built himself over the winter with instructions pulled up on his phone, exactly the way he'd built the swing. The occasion was a small wedding, nothing like the enormous, photographed events Alexander's business associates had always assumed a man of his standing would eventually have. There were no reporters, no 500-person guest list, no seating charts negotiated for months in advance. There was Elena's small circle of friends, a handful of Alexander's genuine relationships that had survived his years of coldness, and Lily, now 4 years old, serving as the world's most serious and self-important flower girl, scattering rose petals down the garden aisle with the exact same careful, two-handed reverence she'd once used to carry a single rose across a marble living room floor. Alexander watched her walk ahead of her mother, watched Elena approach in a simple dress the color of the roses climbing behind her, and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized now, easily, as the opposite of everything that house had once been. Not silence. Not distance. Not a museum built to keep grief at a manageable, sterile arm's length. Home. He thought, standing there, about the 11-year-old boy in a hospital hallway, handed a rose by a sister who wouldn't live to see him grow up, told not to be sad in the last real conversation they'd ever have. He thought about the 17 years he'd spent building an entire empire out of that grief, mistaking distance for safety, mistaking need for weakness, mistaking silence for peace. He thought about how it had taken a 3-year-old with dark curls and a rumpled blue dress, wandering uninvited into his living room, to remind him of something his sister had actually been trying to teach him all along. That a rose handed to someone who looks sad isn't a small thing. It's the whole point. It's someone looking at your pain and deciding, without being asked, that you're worth comforting. Grace had given him that gift once, and he'd spent 17 years unable to receive it. Lily had given it to him again, and this time, finally, gratefully, he'd let himself. After the ceremony, as the small gathering moved into the garden for dinner under string lights, Alexander had insisted on hanging himself. Lily tugged on his sleeve with the particular urgency of a 4-year-old who has decided something is very important. "Are you my daddy now?" she asked with the same total, uncomplicated confidence she'd once used to declare that purple was objectively the best color for the sky. Alexander knelt down to her level, roses blooming behind her in the fading light, and felt his throat tighten around an answer that meant more than any deal he'd ever closed, any company he'd ever built. "Yes," he said. "If you'll have me." Lily's answering smile could have lit the whole garden on its own. She threw her arms around his neck, and over her small shoulder, Alexander caught Elena's eyes, shining with tears that had nothing to do with sadness, and understood, completely, that the coldest man in tech had disappeared entirely, replaced by someone he liked far better, a man who had learned, at last, that the people who need you and the people you need are so often, if you're lucky enough to notice, exactly the same people. If there's one thing this story asks you to carry with you, it's this: sometimes the thing that heals you doesn't arrive with fanfare or warning. Sometimes it walks into your living room in a rumpled dress, holding a single flower, simply because it noticed you looked like you needed one. Don't wait for a hospital hallway or a diagnosis to remind you what matters. Reach for the people in front of you now, while you still have the chance to let them in. If this story moved you, give it a like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who might need the reminder today that it's never too late to let love back in.